They move up along the line that you see on the graph. And there are many economies shown there today. And just to illustrate some of them, there's the USA today, Italy, Portugal, and Brazil. And they're all slowly moving up this line at different rates. And we might look at an economy such as Korea, which has developed very rapidly over the last 30 years. And instead of just looking at where it is today, we look at the pathway that it has followed. And we see it has tracked up this line as wealth has increased and energy use has increased in the Korean economy. And today, we see a very large new economy arriving on the scene, China. And it's already moving onto this line and following the sort of pathway that Korea and other countries have followed over the recent decades. And this is where we first get to understand about the different pathways that economies might go forward on. So here's China today, and we see the trend line for the 20th century. We imagine just for two different scenarios for the routes in which China may take. It may follow the path that Korea took, or it may go on a much more energy efficient pathway, such as we've seen in countries in Europe. And the difference between those pathways by the time we get to 2030, 2040, is the equivalent of a third of the global energy today, just as the difference between two pathways that China might follow in the years to come. And both of these pathways are possible, but of course they will have very different consequences on the environment and the global energy story. To understand this better, it's useful to pull apart what it is that drives CO2 emissions. What are the factors that cause CO2 emissions to rise? And there are really four things. The first is the number of people we have. The second is the amount of wealth that each person wants to have or aspires to have. The third is the amount of energy we use to generate a unit of wealth, which is the efficiency with which we run our economies. And the fourth is the amount of the amount of CO2 we emit for each unit of energy we use. And these are the four things that we have the power to change. Now the reality is that we are not having a discussion about how many people there should be. We may need to have that discussion one day, but that is not a discussion that is really on the table today. And the fastest way for me to get everybody to leave this room is to start to discuss how much wealth everybody should have, because that's not an issue people really want to discuss. And so we're left with two levers in our economy, two things that we can change to alter the pathway for the future. And that's the energy efficiency of our economies and the types of energy we use, or the CO2 emissions associated with the types of energy we use. And these are the two things that we must change a great deal over the coming years to really address the issue of climate change. And we can look at some of the options that we have for change. In the energy sector, we have the types of fuel we use. We have things like nuclear energy. We can move more to renewables. We can move, as Brazil has moved, to bioproducts. And we can employ technologies like carbon dioxide capture and storage, where we take CO2 and we store it back underground. But we can also start to think about how we use our energy in transportation, in buildings, the way we light our buildings, for instance, and even the way we do things and live our lives. We can change this without adjusting our standard of living, but certainly adjusting the amount of energy that we use. The result of this is that we have choices for the future about different pathways that we may follow. And those different pathways have different consequences. So here we have the chart looking out to 2050, and on the vertical axis is emissions. And we could follow a path of quite high emissions, which will result in a very bad outcome in terms of climate change. We can follow a pathway where we start to see emissions plateau and decline over the next 20 years, but that also has very severe consequences still for the climate, although not as severe as the first pathway. Or we can see emissions peak in the very short term and then start to decline very rapidly. And what we want to do is explore how some of these pathways might take place. Today, it looks as if we're on the pathway that's the red dotted line. Our business as usual pathway is following a pathway that's going to lead to an atmospheric concentration of CO2 of more than 1,000 parts per million. More than triple the pre-industrial level, which will certainly lead to very dangerous consequences for our climate. The reality is that we need to change to a very different pathway, somewhere in this space. And you'll see that this really is something that has to change, has to start now. We can no longer delay the changes that are necessary to bring about this very different pathway. And in the International Energy Agency has looked at some of the consequences of moving to this much lower CO2 pathway.